Horror games play by a completely different set of rules. In the past, I've argued that games should first and foremost be fun and enjoyable to play, but the core purpose of any kind of horror media really is to unnerve and to make the recipient uncomfortable. So you'd have to wonder if horror games are supposed to be fun. And they are, but in the same way that people like skydiving or even just watching horror movies. It's the adrenaline that you keep coming back for, and some people like that feeling of discomfort. Only for the right reasons though. And it brings up an interesting quandary when considering bad horror games, because there are plenty of games out there that are of serviceable quality that don't really understand how to scare a player. Not so much that they try and fail, but they think that putting in zombies and a bit of gore is all that's needed, and I have been on the internet for a while, my friend, you're gonna have to try harder than that. I mean, I saw a video when I was 13 where this guy fucked up his face, and I still see it every time I close my eyes. You got anything like that in your generic zombie survival game? I'd be pleasantly surprised. So I'd like to put the focus on actual horror games that at least make some kind of effort to do the horror thing of creating an unsettling atmosphere and putting the pressure on the player's abilities to function, I suppose. In reality, every game on here fails in numerous different ways, but I like to think that we can at least learn something from what they do wrong. Primarily, that fear is subjective, and that I'm not always right. Didn't need me to tell you that, did you? Now that I'm in this advantageous position of talking about shitty horror games, you have no idea how much the angsty internet contrarian inside me wants to take this opportunity to tear into Five Nights at Freddy's. The obsession surrounding this franchise has simmered down in recent years, but I feel like the whole 4 games released inside 12 months thing kind of left a lot of people a little tired with this whole genre of horror. And I call it that because the first FNAF game is genuinely kind of groundbreaking for crafting a type of horror that is so rarely seen outside of Night Trap. You could also say that FNAF deserves credit for introducing a new generation of kids to horror, which, at least for the first couple of games, was of a decent standard. But, surprisingly enough, if you make 4 games in a year, standards start to slip. I'll give Scott Cawthon some credit because each of the numbered Five Nights at Freddy's games feel distinct from one another, and effort was clearly put in to shake up things from one game to the next. Unfortunately, by the time you get to Five Nights at Freddy's 3, the formula's already been established. 1 and 2 are very similar games when you really look at them. The problem is the difference in the third game was bad. It wasn't bad because it was different, it was just bad. I can tolerate most Five Nights at Freddy's games, but I struggle immensely with the third one for a multitude of different reasons. Surprisingly, this game marks a decent shift in perspective, since while you are still checking a bunch of monitors to avoid the inevitable jump scare and reach the end of the night, you're actually working in an amusement park this time, and there's only one animatronic to worry about. Sounds really easy, but it's not, and I hate it. The cracks start to show when you dive into the meat of the game, where you'd imagine that keeping an eye on and manipulating one robot wouldn't be too tricky. But FNAF 3 has ways of randomly throwing you off through hallucination jump scares that don't end the night but will leave you stunned and vulnerable for a few seconds. The sole animatronic spring trap just shows up out of nowhere despite not being anywhere near the control room, and sometimes the methods you use to divert Springtrap away don't work whatsoever. Oh, that's good to know that the only tactical part of this game that I'm controlling through my brain doing shit occasionally doesn't affect the final outcome in any way. This is pretty much where Five Nights at Freddy's started to veer off course and into a world of self-indulgent lore and mediocre horror games. I mean, the first 2 games are pretty great, but you make so many in such a short space of time, and naturally, one of them is gonna suck hard. But hey, if you're into the jump scares and the YouTubers screaming at the top of their lungs at the jump scares, then go right ahead, kid. Come back to me when you want something that challenges you. There are certain tropes that frequently show up in video games that, simply put, you should not make a video game solely based around this not very pleasing trope. It might help your game stand out from the rest because no other developer wants to do that, but at what cost? Are you genuinely serious that you're going to make a game that is Just one large escort mission. Who the hell wants to play that? The best horror games are a mix of different genres that, when combined with the right atmosphere and pacing, create a uniquely terrifying experience that will stick with you for some time after. I remember before Amy the video game came out that a few people in the media were excited for this original horror concept, with a stronger focus on narrative and the relationship between two people caught in the middle of a zombie apocalypse. The word pretense comes to mind, and while Amy was able to wow some journalists with its premise, I think, the actual reviews were a little less flattering. I do like how in Amy's launch trailer there's a quote from IGN how it's like Ico but with zombies and brilliant! And then there's the IGN review which gives it a 2 out of 10 and a horrifyingly bad. That's not misleading at all. If you need any more explanation for why Amy is an awful game than the fact that it's a 4.5 hour escort mission, then I may also struggle to convince you that you need to drink water in order to live. I really need to reiterate that the premise is at least decent. Amy is a young girl who can use her psychic powers to stave off the zombie virus and also protect her Lana, creating an unbreakable bond between the two that lasts 4.5 hours and becomes increasingly more irritating as you realize that all the effort was put into the ideas and not into the execution of those ideas. These two rely on each other so much that they're effectively tethered together, with Amy being useless without Lana, Lana being useless without Amy, and both being fractionally less useless together. This is a game that fights you as you attempt to wrestle control with a janky camera that'll kill you more times than not, and giant gaps between checkpoints, forcing you to repeat previous agonizing sections over again until blood fills up behind your eyes and you come to the conclusion that Amy might not be worth saving. There is a fundamental lack of understanding of how to make a game not frustrate the living hell out of a player, and now I know why. Because Vector Cell also made the god-awful Flashback remake as well. I admire the ambition, but also fuck off with this stupid shit. Just bite me now, zombies, I don't care anymore. The easy and incorrect assumption to make is that older games never really grasped the finer details of how to make a good horror game. Certainly, the dawn of the 3D age helped to mold both standard and survival horror games as we know them today, but there are some real gems from the 8-bit and 16-bit era that achieve exactly what they set out to do, despite the graphical limitations. Clock Tower is a bit goofy, but tries very hard to establish a creepy ambience in which you're being chased around by a guy and his freakishly large pair of scissors. I'd also recommend I Have No Mouth But I Must Scream for just being a relentless case study into the darkest reaches of the human mind. Now in video game form, how fun! However, they also made an NES adaptation of Friday the 13th, and I'd really rather not. There's a bunch of movie tie-ins from the late 1980s that aren't worth the effort, but Friday the 13th might be one of the all-time worst. This is technically a horror game, and not just because of its association with a popular horror movie and with Wikipedia stating as such, since you're tasked with defeating Jason as any one of the 6 camp counselors, which can only be done by throwing stones at zombies and lighting fires. Fuck yeah, fires! You know, I like horror games that make me feel a little bit useless, but I think Friday the 13th might be taking the piss a bit, since half of what you do does the wrong thing, like moving to the right, which actually takes you to the left, and the other half doesn't do anything, like fighting Jason, which is goddamn impossible. Though, in the game's defense, finding Jason in the overworld is legitimately terrifying since you are so weak and useless as a character, and when he's throwing these weird rectangles at you, there's nothing you can do. Except zoom in and find out that the rectangles say that if you've enjoyed this video, consider subscribing for more like it, and hitting that bell to receive notifications of every new upload. I'd prefer to be killed by a machete, but whatever. I've got nothing else to say about this game, other than the fact that this is the 3rd game that Atlas ever made. The same company who last year made one of the best ever RPGs in Persona 5. I'd be inspired, but I can't feel anything anymore. Some of the best horror games you could ever wish to play are also, coincidentally, indie games. It's almost like large companies and developers aren't so keen to make an intricate horror game which might not appeal to a wide demographic, but a smaller team of people who are really passionate about their work they might be a little bit more excited about it. But indie games can also be terrible. Just because someone can make a game doesn't mean that they should. Oh boy, does Nintendo let some shit onto its eShop. To be fair, this is hardly a problem exclusive to Nintendo, since Sony and Microsoft, and especially Steam, have all been guilty of lapses in quality control, but Nintendo still proudly shows off its seal of quality, which ends up on both Super Mario Odyssey and Vroom in the Night Sky. So you gotta be a bit cautious with the money you go throwing around on these online stores, since you never quite know what kind of crap is lurking around the corner. But then there's Valletta, a game that did the rounds in 2014 as it quickly made headlines to being a game that really shouldn't be on the Wii U's eShop. But why? Was it just that scary? Was it just that good a horror game? Were people terrified? Oh man, wouldn't that have been cool? How many scary letters have you read recently? In fact, it's 2018. What even is a letter? How do I get one? This is a strange game to play because it's clearly made on less than a shoestring budget with pre-existing assets thrown together haphazardly, and you can see the faint remnants of someone's vision for a horror game in here somewhere, but not a lot else. You can beat the letter inside 15 minutes, during which absolutely nothing happens of any note as you're slowly fed this bare-bones story of following these letters that leads to very little, and that is the whole game. Basically, I can't do much justice to describing it. I feel strange saying that it's a horror game because you're never in any danger, but some of these environments are dimly lit while mildly spooky music plays in the background, so kind of. The letter went through an Indiegogo campaign and only received $377 out of the $5,000 required, which I suppose explains the quality of the game, but it doesn't explain why Nintendo approved it for the eShop. There can't be many more depressing experiences than buying a Wii U in 2018 and seeing that the letter is still on the eShop. It's still there, no one's taken it down. Not to be confused with the visual novel by the same name, which is apparently really, really good. It won't happen more than once. It bums me out a bit that some of the great horror game pioneers of our time have gone through a period of fucking things up. It might sound weird considering where we are now, but 5 to 10 years ago, horror games weren't anywhere near as popular and seen as more of a financial risk that didn't promise the same kind of return as over-the-shoulder action games, for example. This is why Resident Evil went through the transition that it did off the back of a remake of the first game that didn't sell well at all. Resi 4 did a decent job of incorporating horror elements, but the games that came after gradually diluted these tropes down until Resi 6 went for full-on action and that horror magic was dead in the water. The good news is that Resi 7 was a return to form and proved that horror games could generate money and that misguided horror institutions could find their way home. Alone in the Dark hasn't been so lucky. Because I don't think I've ever arrived at the #1 slot for any video and had 2 successive options from the same franchise. Alone in the Dark's big push into the next generation of gaming in 2008 was so far off the mark that this survival horror game is almost tolerable as a blissfully unaware parody action game, with all of its glitches and mid-90s quality voice acting.
Fucking universe!
I think now that I'm weighing up my options, Alone in the Dark Illumination, a game that ended a 7-year wait for a new game in this series, is bad on a whole other level. It's the perfect recipe for success, a horror game that was developed by some idiots called Pure FPS, that comes with online play and had roughly a lunch break's worth of effort put into it. Just guaranteed to print money. But even a generic shooty zombie game would have been better than the game we got in 2015. Atari squeezed this one out around the same time as E3 that year to avoid publicity, for some reason I don't know. But word got around quickly that Alone in the Dark Illumination was easily one of the worst games of the year. The unfinished nature of the game created a breeding ground for glitches and poor optimization, with missing textures and sound effects acting as an extra kick in the teeth. Even better, Illumination has that online play that I talked about earlier, which is both incredibly ambitious, considering the game it's attached to, and also very cruel to expect any one of your friends to join you for a match. What's worse, this game is designed around multiplayer, so you can clumsily stumble around these poorly lit areas, frantically firing at zombies, but you won't get far without friends. and anyone who invited me to play this game with them wouldn't be a friend for very long. This has been RabbidLuigi, and Alone in the Dark was already a franchise that has suffered so much abuse throughout its history from developers who had no idea what they were doing, but Illumination has effectively killed any hope of a Resident Evil-like revival and has left the franchise as dead as it's ever been. Incidentally, the last two Alone in the Dark games have both been terrible. They've also both been published by Atari, so methinks Atari should have stayed dead. Have you got a topic that you'd like me to talk about next week? Make sure you leave a comment about that down below, because I'll be taking the most interesting suggestions and making a poll on the next video. In fact, here's one right now that I prepared from last week. I'll be revealing the winner of the poll on Twitter and taking suggestions for games to talk about that are related to that topic. So feel free to follow me over there so we can keep in touch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.